So there's no competition.
Yep.
The problem with no competition is that when there's no choice, there's no real incentive to do the hard work that produces improvement. And there's actually no possibility even for comparison between different systems, right?
So Jordan Peterson recently had Corey DeAngelis on his podcast, and Corey is a specialist in terms of education and school choice. The two talk about the failures of the U.S. education system, which are generally acknowledged among the U.S. populace between the right and the left at times. But it really focuses this conversation on competition. So I thought both made pretty good points. Fairness and disclosure, I do know Corey. I've had one conversation with him, but I wanted to listen and react. So let's do that.
So 99% of education PhDs are Marxist institutions.
Yes.
This one was housed in the College of Education, but not a lot of people liked us there because it was the Department of Education Reform. Just the very name of the department implied that we're trying to shake things up to try to improve the education.
You said 99% of education PhDs are Marxists? I think it's higher than that.
99.5%.
Yeah, that might be a charitable estimate, right?
Yeah, definitely. The rest of them are socialists. Yeah. Okay, and so how did that institution come to exist, and why does it still exist?
I think it originally was funded by a grant from the Walton Family Foundation, and it still exists. There's professors there. My advisor is named Patrick Wolf, and the Journal of School Choice is actually housed in that department. And Patrick Wolf did a lot of the early evaluations of voucher programs, like in DC, for example. They were able to use random lottery to determine the different outcomes for kids in the public schools versus the private schools. Much like a medical trial, you do the placebo for the kids who lose the lottery, which is the public school system, business as usual. If you win the lottery to get a voucher to go to a private school, Wolf's evaluation, for example, in 2013 found about a 30% increase in the likelihood of graduating from high school from getting more educational opportunities through the voucher. And you can say
that was random?
Yeah, randomized control trial. So you can say with a big enough sample with certainty that this is not because of the family characteristic of the student, it's not because of the student's racial background or their income. It's because of them getting a better opportunity to go to a better school. And so I did that kind of research when I started. My first study was actually with Dr. Wolf, and we found that the Milwaukee voucher program that started in 1990, we found a huge reduction in crime later on in life. So shouldn't be very surprising. You're more likely to graduate.
Independent of graduation rates?
We didn't control for graduation, but it's probably closely linked. If you're more likely to graduate, you're probably going to be more likely to get a job, less likely to be involved with the criminal justice system.
Yeah. Oh, well, okay, let's back up and do a big picture overview. You should perhaps let everybody know. Well, two things. You've authored or co-authored two relatively recent books, right? One of these, this is The Parent Revolution, and that's this year's
2024.
2024. Wow, so
May,
essentially this year.
Pretty recent.
Yeah, and then there was another one that you co-authored. What's the title of that?
Mediocrity, right? 40 Ways Government Schools Are Failing Today's Students, and it was on the 40th anniversary of the Nation at Risk report, which came out, which basically said that, look, our outcomes are horrendous and things haven't gotten any better since then. In some cases, they've gotten worse, and we spend a lot more money than we did back then.
Well, that's better, at least for the people who are
Yeah, if you're not aware, the U.S. spends more money per student than just about every other country in the world. I think it actually does spend more than any other country in the world, but success rates and kind of outcomes are lagging far behind that. So it's always the push to give more money to the schools, give more money to the teachers and administrators, and that's what we need for better education. And costs for education are going up, especially at the collegiate level, by the way, and we aren't getting those results.
Unions, we spend about $20,000 per student per year now, which is about 52% higher than average private school tuition in this country. That spending in the government schools has increased by about 164%, inflation adjusted, since 1970. Have the outcomes gotten 164% better? No, obviously not. But it's because they're not focusing on math and reading. They're focusing on gender ideology and critical race theory in the schools. And
that's such a good point, too. I mean, the things that I think I benefited most from are pursuits that schools never would have touched. Research tactics, investment strategies, basic living skills, stuff that isn't taught. And, you know, a lot of the public school systems are infected by critical race theory and DEI stuff, and it's becoming much more fashionable. There is maybe kind of some hurdles to that now, but, you know, that is what is being emphasized by a lot of these critical theorists.
And if you're focusing on those things and teaching kids to hate your country, it shouldn't surprise us that the academic outcomes aren't getting any better.
Yeah, so why don't you explain exactly what problem you are attempting to address? How would you characterize because you're an interesting person, because lots of people are focusing on the dismal plight of the schools, let's say, and their dreadful expensiveness. You know, 50% of U.S. state budgets are spent on K through 12 education, right? 50%. So that means essentially that the teachers unions have a hammerlock on 50% of the state budgets. And it's worse than that. It means that the faculties of education, and we can talk about them in some detail, because they have a monopoly on teacher certification, basically have their, what would you say, their status is subsidized by half the money that Americans spend at the state level.
Yeah.
Right? And it's the only way they can survive, because I don't know if there's a more dismal faculty than the faculties of education. Social work might compete.
Yeah, they have the lowest scores on all the SATs and other academic credentials, and they also have a monopoly, a geographic monopoly when it comes to the K through 12 government school system, where in most places in America, you live where you live and you're assigned to a school just based on your address, which gives them no incentive to spend additional dollars wisely. I mean, just imagine if you had to shop at a government grocery store that you were assigned to based on where you lived, and they had empty shelves, no food. And when they did have food, imagine if you got food poisoning or it was expired. And if you wanted to go somewhere else, they'd tell you to go complain to the grocery board, who wouldn't listen to you and would try to cut off your mic, which is what happens with the school boards right now. And if you had to just move houses to get access to a better grocery store, that would make zero sense. Or if you had to pay twice, basically once through taxes for the government grocery store you're not using, and then again out of pocket for a grocery store that actually provided you with healthy food.
This is such a good comparison, and I think it's a great argument for anyone that really opposes, you know, expanding school choice options in general. And you can get into the ups and downs of the voucher program. Actually, libertarians disagree on that to some extent at some points because of how it sometimes manifests. But what he's talking about here, what Corey is saying, is applicable to basically any market. So if any market has a government monopoly behind it and trade privileges whereupon only that entity can sell or transact in that product, it disincentivizes quality. And we know this. Like, you can see this in, let's say, you know, big pharma. So the FDA grants monopolies to a few big drug companies in some cases for some products, and that company doesn't really have an incentive to have a very improved product. It's why there's only 3 insulin providers, and a lot of their potential competition can't come to market, and their products are so expensive. People complained about expensive insulin. Same thing's happening with the education system. We've seen the same thing in all sorts of other industries.
That's what we have with the government school system today. You cannot go somewhere else unless you pay twice, essentially, and low-income families are basically just screwed in the worst failure factories that we call public schools today. In places like Chicago, they have like 33 public schools with 0% math proficiency rates, and they spend about $30,000 per kid. And guess what? Their teachers union boss, Stacey Davis Gates, she sends her own kid to a private school. She knows better than anybody else that their schools are not working for kids. And that's the main problem that I see. And everything else trickles out from that monopoly issue. They don't have an incentive.
So there's a number of different monopolies operating that you just described. There's geographic monopoly, right? And that's a good analogy. So there's no competition. The problem with no competition is that when there's no choice, there's no real incentive to do the hard work that produces improvement. And there's actually no possibility even for comparison between different systems, right? So without competition, you don't have any possibility of really head-to-head evaluation, right? And no no necessary incentive for innovation. So there's a geographic monopoly, which you just described. You send your kids to the school that's in your location, and that's that. And then there's a state mandated monopoly because you have to send your kids to
Compulsory
school.
education, yeah.
And then there's a teacher certification monopoly. So we actually,
And that trickles down from the university level into the K through 12 system.
Yeah, certification monopolies are such an understated issue because, consumers will not buy products or services from people that they don't think are well addressed to provide them. And that will happen with or without, government regulation. Consumer electronics is not as highly of a regulated field as drugs. But people know how to rely on which consumer electronics are good or bad, and the companies that don't provide good electronics, consumers turn away from. There's no hard hand of the government that's required to steer them in that direction. Same thing applies to education and any other product or service.
Right. Okay. And now, so you've fundamentally concentrated, and does this include your doctoral research? You fundamentally concentrated on the issue of choice per se. And
Yep.
were you interested in choice as an economist might be interested in choice, or why were you interested
I
in
did
the
my
issue of
bachelor's and
choice?
master's in economics.
Oh, yeah.
And I had a professor there, John Merrifield was his name. He's now a retired professor, but he was probably the only free market professor at the University of Texas, San Antonio that I knew of. And I took all of his classes. He was my advisor. He was affiliated with the Friedman Foundation at the time, which is now called EdChoice, which is a school choice advocacy group. And he was the one who directed me or suggested to me at least 3 different times, hey, you should probably do this PhD program. And I ultimately took his advice, and I'm glad that I did. And that's how I look at the school system. I see it as one of the most socialist institutions that we have in America today, where the government operates the means of production, the schools that you have, whether you want to call it the local, state, or federal government, they all have their hands into the government school system. And taxpayers have to fund it. And there's a monopoly. There's no
also
competition.
kickbacks. What's the percentage of Democrat financial support from teachers unions across the U.S.?
So if you look at
it's in the high 90s, if I remember correctly.
99.9% of Randy Weingarten's union, she's the head of the American Federation of Teachers. She lobbied the CDC to make it more difficult to reopen schools during COVID. That's another story altogether. They knew they could hold children's education hostage to get billions of dollars in ransom payments and so-called COVID relief that started in 2020 because they knew if they were closed, they could say, we need more money because we're closed. It's the same story as we see with the test scores.
And to be honest, this is kind of an interesting subject here because resistance to reopening the government schools was really bad for some families. There's no doubt. A lot of families were not prepared to have one of 2 parents, and there's a lot of single parents, suddenly have to homeschool their children or look for other educational options than the traditional schools that had closed down. But at the same time, I see a silver lining in this. I know a lot of people saw the same because homeschool rates have gotten higher drastically since the lockdowns and since the school closures, sending students that weren't kind of locked into the federal and state stranglehold education system to be able to explore other options for the first time, which I think is a good thing. I think if there's any market that needs more competition, it is education. And a lot of those students finally got a true education for the first time. And really, that's a white pill. That's a source of hope. Of course, again, a lot of parents weren't prepared for that. But the resistance to reopening government schools actually presented something of a silver lining for a lot of students. And I think it really put the light bulb on a lot of parents when that happened.
Say we're failing because we need more money. It's the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results.
They're not doing the same thing because they keep ramping up the mounted costs.
Yeah.
Right. So it's worse than the same thing.
Their same thing is always give us more money. And
progressively more and more all the time. That will always improve education, or at least that's the line, right? But Corey just pointed out earlier how, school expenditures have gone up 162% or whatever the figure was, but certainly scores and literacy rates have not gone up 162%.
It never improves anything.
Smaller classes, more money.
Yes. Right. And in every other industry, if you think about what smaller class sizes actually means, that means lower units of production output for the same inputs.
Yeah.
Everywhere else, you increase your production over time with more
Well,
technology.
and in principle, you'd assume that much of the heavy lifting could have been done by computational technology. And I think that's particularly true if it was applied properly for, when you're teaching children basic skills, likely reading is the best example of this. So when children learn to read, contrary to the whole word theorists who are also a product of the faculties of education and devastated literacy in their theoretical stupidity. So English obviously is a phonetic language, and the way you learn to read is that you learn to associate sounds with letters, and that's actually a rather dull process. There's nothing intrinsically, there's little that's intrinsically interesting about that. Some kids will treat it like a puzzle. Some children can associate letters with sounds very rapidly, and some take much more practice. That's IQ dependent fundamentally, although there are other contributing factors. You can have high IQ kids with dyslexia, but it's basically an IQ phenomenon. But what you want to do with little kids is continual exposure and practice, because they need to produce little neural circuits that recognize each letter and that use the conjunction between the visual system and the auditory system in the brain to tag each letter with a sound. Letters first, 2-letter combinations, 3 letters, small words. Then as you develop expertise, phrases you get in a single glance, and maybe even sentences if you start to become stunningly proficient, right? Computers are unbelievably good at the first part of that, right? Because they're incredibly patient and they can give you immediate feedback. And so, at least in principle, it would be possible to augment teachers with appropriate technology and increase their efficiency. And we've seen none of that, right?
No,
None
we
of
haven't.
that.
All right, so Corey DeAngelis and Jordan Peterson pointed out some of the most serious issues with the education system, and I think Corey knows this subject more than basically anyone in the U.S. Like, I'd put him up against anyone to, point out the shortcomings of the system. And I think it all comes down to monopoly, right? These guys said it. When people are forced to go to and utilize schools in one system that's been set up by the government, not only does the government have, complete control over the curriculum, they have, the choice of where to expend money and where to kind of pull back money from. They also aren't forced to endure any competition. And when you have that, there's not much incentive to provide the results, to provide what is necessary for a market to long endure and be thriving. Corey is a big proponent of the school voucher and school choice movement. That's what he's kind of built his career on. And a lot of the school voucher programs are pretty good. Like, I would admit that. Like, for instance, I think 2 years ago, there was a bill in Arizona that was really good because it essentially opened up school choice options where you'd get a voucher to apply to any private school of your choice. And none of the schools accepting that voucher had to, put down any kind of regulation, like incorporate critical race theory or any kind of controversial curriculum to accept that. However, I just want to say, the flip side of that is we've seen some of the school choice programs in the country develop in a way where it essentially allows the government to turn what are kind of quasi-independent private schools into, again, quasi-controlled government schools, because what they do is they force them, if they want to accept these vouchers, to incorporate all sorts of like curriculum regulations. And unfortunately, for a lot of kids, that's probably worse than the status quo, because if I am sending my son to a private school, I likely do it because I approve of the curriculum. It will help, people make the choice to do that, but that is, I think, the biggest downside of the school choice movement. Nonetheless, really good conversation. I think, Peterson knows a lot about early childhood development. I can't really comment on that, but I think perfect analysis of the shortcomings of the U.S. education system here. But let me know in the comments below, do you guys agree with this? Do you guys agree with Jordan Peterson and Corey DeAngelis? And what do you think is the proper solution? If it's me, it's get the government out of education completely. So until the next time, I say no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll see you in the next one.